Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? And what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. In the scorching badlands of Arizona, where ancient secrets lie buried beneath layers of red sand and forgotten time, one man's greatest loss was about to become his most extraordinary discovery. What happens when 8 centuries of hidden Templar treasure collides with modern corporate greed? What happens when a broken miner's obsession with his family's death leads him to artifacts that could rewrite American history? This is the story of how a medieval brass medallion, clutched in the trembling hands of a man who'd lost everything, would unlock the greatest secret the Knights Templar ever left behind, and how sometimes the most priceless treasures choose us when we've been abandoned by hope itself. The Arizona sun beat down on Thomas McKenzie's shoulders with the merciless intensity of a forge, each ray seeming to find the threadbare patches in his torn flannel shirt. At 68, Tom's body carried the accumulated weight of 4 decades spent in the bowels of copper mines, shoulders permanently hunched from crawling through low tunnels, hands scarred and gnarled from wrestling with unforgiving machinery, face carved into deep canyons by years of desert wind and the relentless erosion of loss. He knelt in what had once been his sanctuary, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a life that had taken him 15 years to build and corporate arsonists 3 hours to destroy. The cabin where he'd spent countless nights poring over mining records and territorial surveys was nothing but a foundation of blackened stones and twisted metal. The workshop where he'd restored his grandfather's antique mining equipment had been reduced to a pile of charred timber that still smoldered in the morning heat, sending thin spirals of smoke into the crystalline desert air. The irony burned hotter than the flames that had consumed his research. 40 years of meticulous documentation, geological surveys, territorial mining claims, hand-drawn maps of cave systems that honeycombed the Arizona highlands, all reduced to ash because he'd refused to sell his mining claim to Meridian Corporation. 15 years of obsessive work, the only thing that had kept him sane after the accident that killed his wife and daughter, wiped out in a single night of electrical malfunction. Tom's arthritic fingers closed around the only thing that had survived the inferno, a medieval brass medallion that had been in his family for 3 generations. The metal was warm from his body heat, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, but the intricate design remained clearly visible. A Maltese cross surrounded by symbols that his grandfather had claimed were older than the Crusades themselves. Professor Jeremiah McKenzie had been a dreamer, an amateur historian who'd spent his retirement chasing legends across the American Southwest. Tom's father had always spoken of Jeremiah with fond exasperation, calling him brilliant but impractical, a man who valued ancient mysteries over modern necessities. But the old professor had died, swearing that the medallion was the key to the greatest treasure the Knights Templar had ever hidden, secreted away in caves that predated European contact with the New World. "Still digging through the trash, old-timer?" The voice cut through the desert silence like a rusty blade, carrying with it the particular brand of cruelty that corporate money bought and conscience couldn't afford. Jake Morrison stepped out from behind one of the black SUVs that had brought Meridian's security team, his tactical vest and military-grade equipment making him look like a soldier playing at being a cop. At 32, Morrison represented everything Tom had learned to despise about the New West. A former military contractor who'd traded his country's service for corporate paychecks, using skills learned in foreign wars to intimidate American citizens on their own soil. His equipment was worth more than most men made in a year, and his attitude suggested he viewed civilian property rights as obstacles to be eliminated, rather than freedoms to be protected. Behind Morrison came the other 2 members of the security team, Marcus Webb, a thick-set man with prison tattoos who took visible pleasure in other people's misery, and David Chen, a cold-eyed surveillance specialist who treated human displacement like a technical problem to be solved through the application of superior technology. Property seizure was finalized yesterday, Chen announced, consulting his tablet with the detached efficiency of someone who'd delivered similar news countless times before. You're trespassing on Meridian Corporation property now. Tom felt his jaw clench until his teeth ached. Meridian Corporation, the multinational vultures who'd been circling Arizona's mining region for 5 years, buying up mineral rights and forcing out independent miners who'd worked these hills for generations. They claimed to be extracting lithium for electric vehicle batteries, but Tom knew greed when he saw it, and these men carried themselves with the arrogance of conquerors rather than legitimate businessmen. This claim's been in my family since 1924, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of nearly a century of honest labor. My grandfather filed the original papers with the territorial government, and now it's going to be strip-mined for rare earth minerals. Webb laughed, the sound ugly in the pristine desert air. Progress, old man. Your little hobby operation is standing in the way of America's energy independence. The words hit Tom like physical blows, each one designed to strip away another layer of dignity. He thought about the mining accident 15 years ago, how he'd authorized the deep excavation that caused the cave-in that killed Margaret and Rebecca. His wife and daughter had died because he'd pushed too hard, too fast, chasing mineral deposits instead of following the safety protocols that might have saved their lives. The 3 security operatives spread out across Tom's claim with the casual confidence of conquerors, their expensive equipment beeping and clicking as they reduced his family's legacy to digital measurements. Tom watched Chen photograph the burned remains of his workshop, probably for insurance documentation, while Morrison set up some kind of ground-penetrating radar where Tom's grandfather had first discovered the cave entrance that started everything. You know what I love about these old claims? Morrison called out, his voice dripping with false nostalgia. So much wasted potential. So much inefficiency. Really makes you appreciate modern extraction methods. Tom's hands clenched into fists, the brass medallion pressing sharp edges into his palm. He thought about Rebecca, who would have been 37 now, who'd planned to study geology and help modernize the family mining operation. Rebecca, who died in the cave-in because Tom had insisted on personally inspecting every inch of the excavation, bringing his family into danger because he couldn't trust anyone else with his obsessions. Of course, we'll have to blast out all these old tunnels, Webb added, consulting his tablet. Fill them with concrete to prevent cave-ins. Can't have unstable ground interfering with the heavy machinery. The caves where Tom's grandfather had spent decades mapping symbols and passages that seemed to follow medieval European design principles. The underground network where Tom had retreated after the accident, spending months at a time studying stone carvings and metal fragments that suggested the presence of Europeans in Arizona centuries before Columbus. The sanctuary where he'd tried to decode his grandfather's research, hoping to find some meaning in the tragedy that had destroyed his family. Above them, ravens circled in the cloudless blue sky, their shadows passing over the ruins like dark omens. Tom wondered if they sensed the death of something more than buildings, the death of a way of life that had sustained independent miners for over a century, the death of dreams that had motivated 3 generations of McKenzie men to believe that patient work and careful study could unlock the secrets hidden in Arizona's red earth. Speaking of efficiency, Chen said, lowering his camera, we're going to need you gone by noon. Blasting crew arrives tomorrow to start clearing the site. Blasting crew, explosive charges that would collapse tunnels and destroy evidence of whatever his grandfather had discovered in the deep caves. Tom had seen it happen to other independent operations throughout the region, corporate efficiency that treated historical significance as an inconvenience to be eliminated through the judicious application of dynamite. The Arizona air shimmered with heat waves that turned distant mesas into liquid mirages, and Tom felt sweat trickling down his spine despite his body's adaptation to desert conditions developed over decades of mining work. The three security operatives continued their methodical documentation of his property, measuring and photographing every structure as if cataloging artifacts from a dead civilization. "You know what's funny?" Morrison said, leaning against the fence post where Tom had mounted the plaque commemorating his grandfather's original claim. "My boss was worried you might cause trouble. File appeals, get lawyers involved, make noise with environmental groups, but look at you. Just standing there like a scarecrow, watching your whole world disappear." The words hit Tom with surgical precision, each one designed to maximize psychological damage. He thought about the legal proceedings, how he'd sat in courtrooms in Phoenix while corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits discussed his property like it was nothing more than acreage to be acquired and exploited. His grandfather's research, his family's history, his own 15 years of obsessive investigation, all dismissed as the hobbies of irrelevant men standing in the way of progress. Chen finished photographing the entrance to the main mine shaft, the opening his great-grandfather had hand-carved using techniques learned in the copper mines of Montana. "Emotional attachment is just another form of market inefficiency," he said, his voice clinical. "The earth doesn't care who owned it. It just produces whatever value modern technology can extract." Webb laughed at something on his tablet screen. "Says here this claim was assessed at $2.3 million last year. We picked it up at tax auction for $80,000. That's what I call return on investment." $2.3 million. More money than Tom's family had ever dreamed of accumulating, more than his grandfather could have imagined when he filed the original mining claim, with nothing but determination and a worn brass medallion that supposedly pointed toward Templar treasure. But to these corporate operators, it was just another line item, another acquisition in their endless hunger for mineral resources. Tom felt something breaking inside his chest, some final restraint that had been holding back 15 years of accumulated grief and rage. He took a step toward Morrison, his weathered hands forming fists around his grandfather's medallion, but then stopped as he caught sight of movement on the southern horizon. Through the heat haze, something was approaching from the direction of the Hopi reservation, moving with purposeful determination across the trackless desert that separated tribal lands from his mining claim. At first, the approaching figure looked like another mirage, a dark shape wavering through the superheated air that rose from the baked earth. But as it drew closer, Tom realized he was looking at a woman on foot, carrying what appeared to be a heavy pack, and moving with the steady pace of someone accustomed to desert travel. The woman was clearly Native American, probably Hopi based on her direction of approach, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged to this landscape in ways that corporate intruders never could. Even from a quarter-mile away, Tom could see that she was young, perhaps 35, and moved with the purposeful gait of someone on a specific mission rather than a casual hiker. But there was something else about her approach that made Tom's pulse quicken with recognition. She was heading directly for his mining claim, navigating the unmarked desert with the precision of someone following a map or responding to specific knowledge about this location. "What the hell is that?" Morrison squinted into the distance, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio clipped to his tactical vest. The woman continued her approach. And now Tom could make out details that deepened the mystery of her presence. She wore practical hiking clothes that had seen serious use, carried a leather satchel that looked like it contained scientific equipment, and moved with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for a long journey. Most intriguingly, she seemed to be carrying what looked like stone tablets or archaeological specimens. Probably just some reservation Indian, Webb said dismissively. These desert tribes wander around looking for peyote or whatever. Animal control will deal with it. But Tom knew the difference between casual wandering and purposeful travel, and this woman was definitely heading somewhere specific. She moved with the confidence of someone following established landmarks, navigating by reference points that weren't visible to untrained eyes, but were as clear as highway signs to those who understood the desert's hidden geography. Chen raised his camera, focusing on the approaching figure. Might want to document this. Environmental groups sometimes use tribal members to interfere with legitimate mining operations. The woman was close enough now that Tom could see her face, intelligent, determined, marked by the kind of focused intensity that he recognized from his own years of obsessive research. She carried herself like someone with advanced education and professional credentials, not a casual protester or environmental activist. More importantly, Tom could see that she was studying his mining claim with the same careful attention he'd seen in archaeologists and geological surveyors. This wasn't a chance encounter or random desert wandering. This woman had come here looking for something specific. Dr. Sarah Yazzie covered the final 100 yards at a measured pace that spoke of careful energy management during desert travel. Tom found himself studying her approach with the analytical attention he'd developed during decades of mining work, noting details that confirmed his growing suspicion that her presence was connected to larger forces at work in the region. She wore field clothes that had seen extensive use, hiking boots resoled multiple times, cargo pants with the kind of strategic patches that spoke of serious outdoor work, and a wide-brimmed hat that had been shaped by years of desert sun. Her pack was clearly professional equipment, loaded with the kind of scientific instruments that university researchers carried into remote locations, but it was the stone tablets she carried that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. Even from 50 yards away, he could see that they were covered with carved symbols. Not the pictographs typically associated with southwestern tribal art, but more complex markings that stirred memories of his grandfather's research into pre-Columbian European contact. "Look at the size of those rocks," Morrison breathed, momentarily forgetting his role as corporate intimidator. "Must be archaeological specimens. University types love this desert mysticism bullshit." Sarah approached to within 30 feet of the group before stumbling slightly, her professional composure cracking for just an instant. Tom saw her sides heaving with labored breathing, saw the way her shoulders had begun to droop despite her obvious efforts to maintain dignity and authority. This accomplished woman was suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. Without conscious thought, Tom took a step forward, his mining supervisor instincts overriding everything else. He'd seen enough people in distress to recognize the signs. This woman was beyond exhaustion, running on pure willpower and professional determination. Sarah's dark eyes fixed on Tom's face, and in that moment of connection, something passed between them that transcended cultural barriers and corporate interference. Tom felt a jolt of recognition, as if he were looking into the eyes of someone who understood loss, displacement, and the weight of carrying responsibilities too heavy for any single person to bear. Then she took another step forward and collapsed. Dr. Sarah Yazzie's legs simply gave out, sending her crashing to the desert floor along with her precious stone tablets. The archaeological specimens scattered across the red earth, and Tom caught a glimpse of symbols that made his heart race with impossible recognition, markings that seemed to match the designs carved into his grandfather's brass medallion. The woman lay on her side, her professional equipment scattered around her like the debris of academic ambition meeting desert reality. But even in unconsciousness, her hands clutched protectively at the leather satchel she'd carried across miles of trackless wilderness. "Well, that solves that problem," Webb said, pulling out his radio with casual indifference. "I'll call Border Patrol. They can haul her back to the reservation after the medics check her out." The callousness in his voice hit Tom like a physical blow. Here was a woman of obvious education and professional credentials, possibly unconscious from heat exhaustion while conducting legitimate research. And these corporate enforcers saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of through bureaucratic channels. "Might want to call it in as a trespassing incident," Chen added, photographing the scattered stone tablets with the same clinical detachment he'd shown for Tom's burned buildings. "Insurance company will want documentation that we handled unauthorized personnel properly." Morrison was already speaking into his radio, his voice carrying the tone of someone reporting a minor administrative problem. "Native American female, appears to be academic researcher, probably heat exhaustion, need tribal police for removal." Tom found himself moving toward the unconscious woman, despite the corporate security team's obvious disapproval. Sarah's face was flushed with heat, her breathing shallow but steady, and her grip on the leather satchel remained firm even in unconsciousness. Whatever she'd been carrying was important enough to risk desert travel during the most dangerous part of the day. "I wouldn't get too close," Webb called out. "These reservation types sometimes carry diseases. Might be drugs involved too." But Tom continued his approach, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. As he knelt beside her, more details became visible that defied the security team's casual dismissal. Her clothing bore the logos of major universities. Her equipment was expensive and professionally maintained, and the stone tablets scattered around her were clearly authentic archaeological specimens rather than tourist artifacts. And there was something else, something that made Tom's blood run cold with recognition and impossibility. The symbols carved into the largest stone tablet weren't just random Native American pictographs. They were complex geometric designs that matched elements of his grandfather's medallion with precision that couldn't be explained by coincidence. Tom's hands shook as he reached for the fallen tablet, afraid to touch it, afraid it might disappear like a mirage if subjected to physical contact. But there was no mistaking what he was seeing. Maltese crosses interwoven with indigenous astronomical symbols, creating patterns that suggested cultural contact centuries before any known European expedition to the American Southwest. His grandfather's voice echoed across the decades. "Samuel, the Knights Templar didn't disappear when Philip the Fair destroyed their order. They scattered across the world, carrying their treasures and their secrets to places where papal authority couldn't reach them." Tom knelt in the desert sand beside the unconscious archaeologist, close enough now to see details that made his understanding of history tilt on its axis. The largest stone tablet, lying just beyond Sarah's outstretched hand, bore carved symbols of breathtaking complexity and precision, not the simple pictographs he'd expected from indigenous artwork, but intricate designs that spoke of advanced mathematical understanding and sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But it was the integration of clearly European symbols with indigenous designs that made Tom's hands tremble with recognition. Maltese crosses were embedded within sunwheels and constellation maps, creating patterns that suggested not conquest or cultural dominance, but collaboration between medieval European knowledge and indigenous astronomical wisdom. Tom's grandfather had spent 40 years trying to prove that the Knights Templar had reached North America centuries before Columbus, carrying with them not just treasure, but advanced knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and metallurgy. Jeremiah McKenzie had died believing that the evidence was hidden in the cave systems beneath Arizona's highlands, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and the right tools to unlock secrets that could rewrite the history of European contact with the New World. Now, scattered in the desert sand around an unconscious Hopi archaeologist, Tom was looking at proof that his grandfather's theories might have been literal truth rather than academic speculation. Sarah stirred slightly, her dark eyes fluttering open to focus on Tom's weathered face. Despite her obvious distress, her gaze was sharp with intelligence and purpose, studying him with the careful attention of someone evaluating potential allies and enemies. "The cross," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "The 9 knights, They came here first. The words hit Tom like lightning, electrifying every nerve in his body. The 9 Knights. That was how medieval chroniclers had referred to the original founders of the Knights Templar, the French nobles who had taken vows of poverty and service in the Holy Land before building an organization that would accumulate wealth and power across Europe. Tom's hand instinctively moved to his grandfather's medallion, feeling the warm brass pressed against his chest beneath his shirt. The symbols carved into that medieval artifact suddenly took on new significance, not just decorative elements or religious imagery, but a map or code that connected European knowledge with indigenous wisdom, preserved in stone tablets for 7 centuries. "You know about the Templars," Tom said, his voice filled with wonder and growing understanding. Sarah's eyes focused on his face with laser intensity, and Tom saw recognition dawning in her expression. "You're McKenzie," she breathed. "Jeremiah McKenzie's grandson, the one who's been mapping the cave systems." Tom's world seemed to contract to the space between himself and this remarkable woman who somehow knew his family's history and understood the significance of his grandfather's research. Sarah struggled to prop herself up on one elbow, her professional training overriding her physical distress as she focused on the implications of their meeting. "Dr. Sarah Yazzie," she said, extending her hand with formal precision, despite her obvious exhaustion. "University of Arizona, Department of Archaeological Sciences. I've been tracking Templar artifacts across the Southwest for 8 years. The corporate security team watched this exchange with growing alarm, obviously recognizing that something significant was happening beyond their understanding or control. Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting on his radio as if preparing to call for additional support. "Whatever academic conference this is supposed to be," he announced with forced authority, "it's happening on private corporate property. Both of you need to clear the area immediately." But Sarah was already reaching into her leather satchel, withdrawing documentation that made Morrison's bluster sound like the yapping of an irrelevant dog. "Federal research permit," she said calmly, handing Tom a laminated card bearing official seals and signatures. "Authorized investigation of pre-Columbian European contact sites under the National Historical Preservation Act." Tom studied the permit with growing amazement. Sarah's research had federal backing and university support, representing the kind of legitimate academic investigation that corporate mining interests couldn't simply dismiss or intimidate. More importantly, her documentation specifically mentioned the McKenzie mining claim as a site of potential historical significance. "My grandfather's research," Tom said slowly, pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally falling into place. "You've been following his work." Sarah nodded, her dark eyes bright with excitement despite her physical distress. "Jeremiah McKenzie was the first researcher to map the cave systems correctly, to understand that the tunnels follow medieval European engineering principles rather than natural geological formation. His documentation suggests the presence of a major Templar site somewhere in this region." Morrison's radio crackled with incoming communication, and Tom caught fragments of urgent conversation, something about federal oversight and legal complications that were threatening to derail Meridian Corporation's extraction schedule. The security team was clearly encountering obstacles they hadn't anticipated, bureaucratic barriers that federal research permits could create. "Look," Morrison said, his earlier confidence cracking under the pressure of unexpected legal complications. "I don't care about your historical treasure hunt. This site is scheduled for mineral extraction starting tomorrow. Whatever academic games you're playing need to happen somewhere else." But Sarah was studying Tom's face with the intensity of someone who had spent years following a trail that was finally leading somewhere concrete. "The medallion," she said quietly. "Your grandfather's brass medallion. You still have it." Tom's hand moved instinctively to his chest, feeling the warm metal beneath his shirt. "How could you possibly know about that?" Sarah's smile was brilliant despite her exhaustion. Because tribal oral history describes it perfectly. The metal talisman of the crossbearers that would guide the worthy to the chamber where two peoples preserved their greatest knowledge together. Tom felt the ground shift beneath his understanding as Sarah's words revealed connections that stretched across centuries and cultures. The idea that Hopi oral traditions preserved memories of medieval European contact seemed impossible, yet the evidence was literally scattered in the sand around them. Stone tablets that integrated Templar symbolism with indigenous astronomical knowledge in ways that suggested genuine collaboration rather than conquest. "The chamber," Tom repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your tribal histories describe an actual location?" Sarah nodded, struggling to sit up fully despite her obvious exhaustion. Stories passed down for 28 generations, describing metal men with crosses who came from the rising sun, bringing knowledge of deep earth mining and star wisdom. They worked with our ancestors to hide something precious in caves that touched the world's roots. Tom's mining experience translated her poetic language into geological terms. Deep cave systems that extended far below the surface mining that most operations attempted in this region. His grandfather had mapped tunnel networks that seemed to follow principles of medieval engineering, with chambers carved according to specifications that suggested knowledge of advanced stonework and hydraulic systems. The corporate security team was growing increasingly agitated as they recognized that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. Morrison spoke urgently into his radio while Chen documented everything with obsessive attention to detail, obviously preparing reports that would explain how their simple property seizure had become complicated by federal research permits and archaeological investigations. "This is ridiculous," Webb announced, his frustration boiling over into open aggression. "We're not going to let some Indian folklore and academic paperwork delay a multi-million-dollar extraction operation." But Sarah was already reaching for another document in her satchel, withdrawing what appeared to be a formal legal injunction bearing federal court seals. "Emergency archaeological protection order," she announced calmly. "Any disturbance of this site pending completion of the federal investigation constitutes destruction of evidence in a matter of national historical significance." Morrison's face went pale as he read the legal documentation. Corporate intimidation tactics were useless against federal court orders, and the kind of legal challenges that archaeological protection could generate would tie up mining operations for years, while lawyers and academics argued about historical significance versus economic development. Tom found himself studying Sarah with growing respect and recognition. Here was someone who understood how to navigate the intersection of academic research, tribal authority, and federal bureaucracy, using knowledge and preparation as weapons against corporate power in ways that pure physical resistance never could. "You've been planning this for a long time," he observed. Sarah's smile carried years of careful preparation and strategic thinking. 8 years of following your grandfather's trail, building federal support for investigation, and waiting for the right moment to challenge corporate destruction of irreplaceable historical sites. Morrison's radio crackled with increasing urgency as his superiors at Meridian Corporation began to grasp the legal and financial implications of federal archaeological intervention. Tom caught fragments of heated conversation, something about project delays, legal challenges, and the kind of regulatory scrutiny that could expose mining operations to environmental oversight and corporate liability. "This is temporary," Morrison announced, but his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "Federal permits can be challenged. Academic research can be expedited. One way or another, this site gets cleared for mining." But Tom could see uncertainty creeping into all three security operatives' expressions. Their perfect corporate plan was encountering obstacles they hadn't anticipated, and the presence of legitimate archaeological research was creating complications that couldn't be solved through intimidation or bureaucratic pressure. Chen finished photographing Sarah's stone tablets, obviously documenting evidence for corporate lawyers who would spend months trying to minimize the historical significance of any discoveries. "Environmental groups use this kind of academic interference all the time," he muttered. "Delay tactics disguised as scientific research." Webb was scanning the horizon with growing paranoia, as if expecting additional complications to emerge from the desert landscape. "How do we know this isn't some kind of coordinated protest operation? These university types work with environmental terrorists all the time." But Sarah was studying Tom's face with the intensity of someone who had spent years following a trail that was finally leading to concrete discoveries. "The caves," she said urgently. "Your grandfather's maps showed entrance points that match our oral traditions exactly. If the Templar site is real, if the chamber exists, it's somewhere in the tunnel systems you've been mapping." Tom thought about the 15 years he'd spent exploring the cave networks after his family's death, using underground mapping as a way to escape the guilt and grief that consumed him above ground. His grandfather's research had provided the foundation, but Tom's mining experience had allowed him to extend the exploration far beyond what an academic archaeologist could have achieved. "The deep chambers," Tom said slowly, pieces of his grandfather's puzzle finally making sense. "There are carved symbols in the lowest levels, marks that don't match any Native American rock art I've ever seen." Sarah's eyes blazed with excitement despite her physical distress. "European stonework techniques integrated with indigenous astronomical calculations. The collaboration your grandfather theorized actually happened." Morrison's radio erupted with static as his supervisors demanded immediate resolution of the developing crisis. Tom could hear angry voices discussing legal strategies, public relations concerns, and the kind of corporate damage control that suggested Meridian Corporation had been anticipating archaeological challenges for some time. 24 hours, Morrison announced with forced authority. "That's how long your federal paperwork buys you. Tomorrow morning, this site gets cleared regardless of historical significance or academic objections." But Tom was beginning to understand that the next 24 hours might be enough to change everything, not just for his family's mining claim, but for the understanding of American history itself. As the afternoon sun reached its brutal peak, painting the desert landscape in shades of copper and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire, Tom helped Sarah move to the shade of his truck while the corporate security team maintained their hostile surveillance from a distance. The archaeological protection orders had created a temporary stalemate, but everyone understood that legal paperwork would only delay rather than prevent Meridian Corporation's extraction plans. Sarah had recovered enough to examine Tom's grandfather's medallion with professional attention, turning the brass artifact over in her hands while comparing its symbols to photographs in her research documentation. The integration of medieval European designs with what appeared to be indigenous astronomical markers confirmed connections that her university research had theorized but never proven. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," she observed, studying the medallion through a magnifying glass that revealed details invisible to casual examination. 14th century metalwork techniques, but the symbolic integration suggests collaboration with indigenous artisans who understood sophisticated astronomical calculations. Tom watched her work with growing fascination, recognizing the careful methodology that reminded him of his grandfather's approach to historical investigation. Sarah combined academic rigor with intuitive understanding, using both scientific analysis and cultural knowledge to decode meanings that purely European or purely indigenous perspectives might miss. "The star charts," Sarah continued, pointing to specific symbols around the medallion's edge. "These match constellation markers that appear in Hopi ceremonial sites, but they're integrated with Templar navigational symbols in ways that suggest shared astronomical knowledge." The corporate security team had established a perimeter around the mining claim, their expensive communication equipment buzzing with constant updates from supervisors who were obviously struggling to develop legal strategies for overcoming federal archaeological protection. Morrison paced like a caged predator, his frustration evident in every movement as he recognized that corporate authority was useless against properly documented federal oversight. "They're planning something," Tom observed, watching the security operatives coordinate their activities with military precision. "Legal delays won't stop them permanently." Sarah nodded grimly, her academic credentials providing insight into the political realities of archaeological protection. Federal permits can be challenged, research schedules can be accelerated, and academic institutions can be pressured to abandon investigations that interfere with corporate interests. We need concrete proof, physical evidence that's too significant to dismiss or destroy. Tom thought about the deep cave chambers he'd mapped over 15 years of obsessive exploration, underground spaces that his grandfather's research had suggested might contain physical artifacts rather than just symbolic carvings. The medallion had always seemed to point toward something specific, but Tom had never possessed the cultural knowledge to decode its directions properly. "The chamber," Tom said slowly. "If it exists, if your tribal histories and my grandfather's research are correct, it would be in the deepest part of the cave system, beyond the mapped tunnels, in sections that would require serious mining equipment to reach safely." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "Equipment that a former mine foreman would know how to operate." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Tom led Sarah to the concealed entrance of the main cave system, a natural opening that his grandfather had discovered, and Tom had spent years expanding using careful excavation techniques learned during decades of mining work. The corporate security team maintained their surveillance from a distance, obviously unwilling to follow them underground without proper equipment and legal authorization. The cave entrance was hidden among a cluster of red sandstone formations that created natural camouflage, invisible to casual observation, but carefully marked according to his grandfather's documentation. Tom had installed basic safety equipment over the years: rope systems, emergency lighting, and ventilation fans powered by solar panels that the corporate team hadn't yet discovered. "This is it," Tom said quietly, unsealing the metal grate that protected the entrance from animals and unauthorized access. "Everything my grandfather theorized about, everything your tribal histories describe, it's all down there waiting to be discovered." Sarah studied the cave opening with professional assessment, noting the careful engineering that had gone into making the natural formation safely accessible. "How deep does it go?" Tom consulted the hand-drawn maps that represented 15 years of methodical exploration, each tunnel and chamber carefully documented using surveying techniques that ensured accurate navigation in complete darkness. "The main passages extend almost 200 feet below surface level, following natural limestone formations that create stable galleries. But there are sections I've never fully explored, areas that would require specialized equipment and multiple people for safety." The corporate security team had established a command post near their vehicles, obviously preparing for extended surveillance, while their supervisors developed strategies for overcoming federal archaeological protection. Tom could see Morrison consulting electronic devices that suggested sophisticated tracking capabilities, technology that could monitor their underground activities even if the security operatives couldn't follow them directly. "They'll track our movements," Sarah observed, noting the same surveillance equipment. "Whatever we discover down there, we'll need concrete documentation that can't be dismissed or suppressed." Tom opened a storage container hidden near the cave entrance, revealing professional archaeological equipment that he'd acquired over years of careful research: cameras designed for underground photography, measuring devices for precise documentation, and sample containers for physical evidence that could withstand scientific analysis. "My grandfather taught me that some discoveries are too important to leave to chance," Tom explained. If we find what I think we're going to find, we'll need proof that can't be denied or destroyed." Sarah nodded with appreciation for Tom's thorough preparation. Academic research, tribal authority, and mining expertise. We're finally bringing together all the elements your grandfather envisioned. As they prepared to descend into the earth, Tom felt the weight of 15 years of grief and obsession transforming into something more purposeful, not just personal redemption through discovery, but the preservation of knowledge that connected cultures across centuries and continents. The medallion around his neck seemed to grow warm against his chest, as if responding to proximity to whatever lay hidden in the deep chambers below. The descent into the cave system was like traveling backward through time, each level revealing progressively older geological formations and increasingly sophisticated human modification of natural spaces. Tom's mining experience guided them through passages that would have been treacherous for academic researchers, while Sarah's archaeological training helped them document evidence with scientific precision. The initial tunnels followed natural limestone formations, but as they descended deeper, the passages began to show clear signs of intentional engineering: walls smoothed according to medieval stonework techniques, drainage systems that prevented water accumulation, and ventilation shafts that suggested knowledge of advanced underground construction principles. "The integration is remarkable," Sarah whispered, photographing carved symbols that appeared at regular intervals along the tunnel walls. European engineering techniques adapted to natural rock formations, but guided by indigenous knowledge of local geological conditions. Tom led them through passages that he'd mapped over years of careful exploration, noting details that took on new significance in the context of Sarah's research. His grandfather's medallion seemed to pulse with warmth as they approached sections of the cave system that Tom had always felt were somehow different, more purposeful than simple geological formations. The tunnels gradually opened into larger chambers, each one revealing more evidence of intentional construction and symbolic decoration. Stone carvings integrated Templar crosses with indigenous astronomical symbols, creating patterns that suggested not just contact between cultures, but genuine collaboration in preserving important knowledge. "This is it," Tom breathed, as they entered the deepest chamber he'd ever discovered, a vast underground space that his mining equipment had revealed, but that he'd never fully explored. Everything my grandfather spent 40 years looking for. The chamber was enormous, carved from solid limestone according to principles that suggested both medieval European cathedral architecture and indigenous ceremonial space design. But it was the contents of the chamber that made both Tom and Sarah stop in wonder, not treasure in the conventional sense, but something far more valuable. Stone tablets filled the chamber, thousands of them arranged in careful rows and columns according to some organizing principle that suggested a vast library or archive. Each tablet was covered with symbols that integrated medieval European knowledge with indigenous astronomical and mathematical understanding, creating a record of collaborative scholarship that predated known European contact by centuries. "It's not treasure," Sarah whispered in amazement. "It's knowledge, a preservation project that saved information from both cultures." Tom studied the vast archive with growing understanding of his grandfather's vision. The Knights Templar hadn't come to the New World seeking gold or conquest. They'd come seeking preservation, carrying their accumulated knowledge to a place where it could be hidden from the religious and political persecution that was destroying their order in Europe. And they'd found indigenous peoples who understood the value of preserving knowledge across generations, creating a collaboration that had successfully hidden one of history's greatest archives for over 700 years. Tom and Sarah moved through the underground archive with reverent attention, each stone tablet revealing new evidence of the collaboration between medieval European knowledge and indigenous wisdom that had created this extraordinary preservation project. The scale of the undertaking became clear as they explored the chamber's full extent. Not just a hiding place for Templar treasure, but a comprehensive library designed to preserve knowledge from both cultures across centuries of potential upheaval. The organization of the archive suggested sophisticated understanding of information preservation and retrieval. Tablets were arranged according to subject matter, astronomical calculations, mining techniques, agricultural innovations, medical knowledge, and technological developments that represented the accumulated wisdom of both European and indigenous scholars. "This changes everything," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe as she photographed tablets that documented astronomical observations spanning centuries. "Not just our understanding of pre-Columbian contact, but the entire narrative of cultural interaction in the New World." Tom studied tablets that detailed mining techniques far more advanced than anything he'd encountered in modern operations. Methods for extracting minerals without environmental devastation, engineering principles for creating stable underground structures, and metallurgical processes that suggested technological capabilities that had been lost to both cultures over the intervening centuries. His grandfather's medallion seemed to pulse with increasing warmth as they approached the center of the chamber, where a raised platform held what appeared to be the archive's most important contents. Stone tablets larger and more elaborately carved than the others, covered with symbols that integrated the most sophisticated elements of both European and indigenous knowledge systems. The master catalog, Tom realized, understanding finally dawning. These tablets don't just contain knowledge, they explain how the entire preservation project was organized. Sarah approached the central platform with academic excitement, tempered by professional caution. The tablets described not just the contents of the archive, but the methodology behind its creation. How Templar scholars and indigenous knowledge keepers had collaborated to preserve information that both cultures considered too valuable to risk losing to conquest, persecution, or natural disaster. But it was the final tablet, positioned at the very center of the platform, that revealed the true significance of what they'd discovered. Carved in symbols that both Tom and Sarah could partially understand, it described not just the preservation of ancient knowledge, but instructions for its application to modern challenges, environmental sustainability, technological development that worked with, rather than against, natural systems, and social organization based on cooperation rather than domination. They weren't just preserving the past, Sarah whispered in growing comprehension. They were creating a blueprint for the future. Tom felt the weight of 7 centuries of hidden knowledge settling on his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. His grandfather had died believing that the Templar archive contained treasure that could change the world. Now Tom understood that the treasure was knowledge itself, and the responsibility that came with it was greater than personal redemption or even historical discovery. The sound of machinery echoed through the cave system, distant but unmistakable, the whine of industrial equipment being transported and assembled above ground. Tom and Sarah exchanged alarmed glances as they realized that their underground exploration had taken longer than anticipated, and the corporate security team was obviously implementing some kind of aggressive response to the archaeological protection orders. "They're not waiting for legal resolution," Tom said grimly, his mining experience allowing him to identify the specific sounds of excavation equipment being positioned. "That's drilling machinery, probably portable rigs designed for rapid site clearing." Sarah quickly secured her camera and documentation, understanding that whatever Meridian Corporation was planning above ground would likely involve sealing or destroying the cave entrance to prevent further archaeological investigation. Federal protection orders mean nothing if they can claim the site was accidentally compromised during routine mining operations. Tom led them back through the tunnel system with increased urgency, his knowledge of the cave layout allowing them to navigate quickly through passages that would have been treacherous for inexperienced explorers. But as they ascended toward the surface, the sounds of corporate activity grew louder and more ominous, the kind of industrial noise that suggested rapid, irreversible changes to the landscape above. "Emergency procedures," Tom explained as they paused at a junction point where multiple tunnels converged. My grandfather designed this system with multiple access points, hidden entrances that corporate surveillance might not have discovered. Sarah followed Tom through a secondary passage that emerged in a different location from their original entry point, concealed among rock formations that provided natural camouflage from above-ground observation. The alternative exit allowed them to observe corporate activities without being immediately detected by the security team's surveillance equipment. What they saw confirmed Tom's worst fears about corporate intentions and capabilities. Meridian Corporation had brought in heavy equipment under cover of darkness, drilling rigs, excavation machinery, and industrial vehicles that suggested a full-scale mining operation rather than simple site preparation. More importantly, the equipment was positioned to begin immediate extraction work that would destroy the cave system regardless of federal protection orders. They're claiming emergency mineral extraction, Sarah observed, reading corporate signage and legal documentation posted prominently around the industrial equipment. National security priority overrides archaeological protection under the Strategic Materials Act. Tom felt his understanding of corporate power and legal manipulation deepen as he recognized the sophistication of Meridian's response to federal oversight. They weren't simply ignoring archaeological protection. They were using higher-level legal authorities to override federal research permits, claiming that national defense needs superseded historical preservation concerns. The archive, Tom said quietly, recognizing that 7 centuries of preserved knowledge was about to be destroyed by industrial greed disguised as patriotic necessity. Everything my grandfather worked for, everything your people preserved, it's all going to be lost. But Sarah was studying the corporate operation with the analytical attention of someone who understood bureaucratic warfare as well as academic research. Not if we can prove what we've discovered before they begin extraction operations. Tom and Sarah crouched among the red sandstone formations that concealed the secondary cave entrance, watching corporate machinery being positioned with military precision around their mining claim. The scale of the operation confirmed that Meridian Corporation had been planning this extraction for months, using legal challenges and bureaucratic delays as diversions, while they assembled the equipment and personnel necessary for rapid, comprehensive site clearing. 12 hours, Sarah estimated, studying the corporate timeline posted on temporary signs around the industrial equipment. That's how long they need to position everything for simultaneous extraction from multiple points. Once they begin drilling, the cave system will be compromised beyond recovery. Tom consulted his grandfather's maps and his own exploration records, calculating the time required to document the most critical elements of the underground archive. 15 years of methodical exploration had given him knowledge of passages and chambers that corporate surface surveys couldn't detect. But photographing and cataloging 7 centuries of preserved knowledge would require more time than they had available. The central tablets, Tom decided, recognizing that difficult choices had to be made. If we can't preserve everything, we focus on the master catalog and the most significant collaborative works, evidence that proves the collaboration existed and demonstrates its importance. Sarah nodded with the grim understanding of someone who had spent years fighting corporate destruction of archaeological sites. Academic documentation that can't be dismissed as folklore or fabricated evidence, physical proof that requires institutional response regardless of corporate interests. They descended back into the cave system with renewed urgency, their movements guided by Tom's intimate knowledge of the tunnel layout and Sarah's professional understanding of archaeological documentation priorities. The portable equipment Tom had accumulated over years of research allowed them to work quickly and efficiently, photographing tablets and collecting physical samples that could survive scientific analysis. But as they worked in the deepest chambers, the sounds of industrial activity above ground grew louder and more ominous. Corporate drilling had begun at multiple points around the mining claim, creating vibrations that echoed through the cave system like distant thunder. Tom's mining experience allowed him to interpret the sounds with growing alarm. This wasn't exploratory drilling, but full-scale extraction designed to pulverize everything below ground level. They're not mining for lithium, Tom realized with dawning horror. They're using mineral extraction as cover for total site destruction. They know what's down here. Sarah looked up from photographing the central tablets, her face pale with understanding. Corporate archaeological investigation. They've known about the archive for years, but instead of preserving it, they're destroying it to prevent academic study that might interfere with mining operations throughout the region. The vibrations from above-ground drilling were growing stronger, and Tom could hear the subtle sounds that indicated structural stress in the cave system. His grandfather had chosen this location because the limestone formations were naturally stable, but industrial drilling could compromise that stability in ways that would make the underground chambers inaccessible or dangerous. "We need to get out," Tom said reluctantly, recognizing that their time for documentation was running out. The whole system could collapse if they compromised the supporting formations. But Sarah was staring at the central tablet with expression of sudden comprehension. "Tom, look at this. The final instructions. They're not just about preserving knowledge. They're about activating it." The activation protocol. The central tablet that Sarah had been studying revealed information that transformed their understanding of the entire archive from a passive preservation project to an active knowledge system designed to respond to specific conditions. The symbols described not just the contents of the library, but procedures for accessing and implementing the preserved knowledge when circumstances warranted its revelation. "It's a trigger mechanism," Sarah explained with growing excitement despite the industrial destruction occurring above them. "The archive wasn't meant to remain hidden forever. It was designed to become available when the knowledge it contained became necessary for addressing major challenges." Tom studied the activation protocol with his grandfather's medallion growing warm against his chest, understanding finally dawning about the true purpose of the brass artifact he'd carried for 40 years. The medallion wasn't just a key or a map. It was a component in a larger system designed to authenticate legitimate access to the preserved knowledge. The symbols on the central tablet described environmental, social, and technological indicators that would signal appropriate timing for revealing the archive's contents. Conditions like environmental degradation from mineral extraction, cultural conflict over land use, and the need for sustainable technologies that could support growing populations without destroying natural systems. The mining crisis, Tom realized with wonder. Corporate destruction of the environment, conflicts between indigenous rights and industrial development, the need for sustainable extraction methods, all of it matches the conditions described in the activation protocol. Sarah was photographing the activation instructions with renewed urgency, understanding that they had discovered not just historical artifacts, but potentially functional solutions to contemporary problems. "The collaborative knowledge your grandfather and my ancestors preserved. It's not just historical curiosity. It's technology and methodology that could address current environmental and social challenges." The drilling sounds from above grew more intense, and Tom could feel the cave system beginning to respond to the structural stress being imposed by industrial machinery. Cracks appeared in some of the chamber walls, and dust fell from the ceiling as the limestone formations absorbed vibrations they hadn't been designed to handle. "The emergency preservation protocol," Tom said, reading additional symbols that described procedures for protecting the archive's most critical contents during times of immediate threat. They planned for this kind of situation. The tablet described methods for creating redundant documentation and establishing alternative storage sites that could preserve the essential knowledge even if the primary archive was compromised. Emergency procedures that would allow the collaborative wisdom to survive attempts at destruction by those who saw knowledge as a threat to their power and profit. Mobile preservation, Sarah understood. We don't have to save the entire archive. We need to activate the emergency protocols and establish the knowledge in forms that can't be destroyed by corporate vandalism. Tom felt the weight of 7 centuries of preservation effort, focusing into this single moment of crisis and opportunity. His grandfather had spent 40 years preparing for this discovery, and now the responsibility fell to Tom to ensure that the knowledge survived long enough to fulfill its intended purpose. The corporate confrontation. As Tom and Sarah emerged from the cave system carrying critical documentation and photographic evidence of the underground archive, they found themselves facing a transformed landscape above ground. Meridian Corporation had converted the mining claim into an industrial site that resembled a military operation more than a civilian extraction project. Jonathan Blackwood stood near the Central Command trailer, a figure whose presence elevated the corporate response far beyond simple mining operations. At 52, Blackwood carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to complex international operations. His expensive suit and military bearing suggesting connections that extended beyond corporate boardrooms into government and intelligence communities. "Dr. Yazzie, Mr. McKenzie," Blackwood said with formal courtesy that couldn't disguise the underlying threat in his position. "I understand you've been conducting unauthorized exploration of a restricted mining site." Tom recognized immediately that they were no longer dealing with corporate security guards or local enforcement. Blackwood represented the kind of authority that could override federal protection orders and academic research permits through appeals to national security and strategic resource requirements. "Federal archaeological protection," Sarah responded, producing her documentation with professional confidence despite the obvious escalation in corporate response. "This site is protected under multiple federal statutes that supersede local mining claims." Blackwood studied Sarah's permits with the attention of someone familiar with federal bureaucracy and legal jurisdictions. "Dr. Yazzie, I'm sure you understand that national security interests sometimes require difficult choices about resource allocation and site development." The conversation was taking place against a backdrop of industrial machinery that had transformed Tom's family mining claim into something unrecognizable. Drilling rigs positioned with mathematical precision, excavation equipment capable of pulverizing limestone formations, and monitoring devices that suggested sophisticated understanding of underground geological structures. "You know what's down there," Tom said, recognizing that corporate knowledge of the archive explained the scale and sophistication of the extraction operation. "This isn't about lithium mining. You're trying to destroy evidence of pre-Columbian European contact." Blackwood's expression remained professionally neutral, but Tom caught subtle signs of recognition that confirmed his suspicions about corporate motivations. "Mr. McKenzie, your family has maintained this mining claim for almost a century. Surely you understand the importance of mineral resources to American economic and strategic interests." Sarah stepped forward with the confidence of someone who understood bureaucratic warfare and institutional politics. "Mr. Blackwood, the knowledge preserved in this archive represents collaborative solutions to environmental and technological challenges that could benefit both corporate interests and indigenous communities." For the first time, Blackwood's professional composure showed signs of genuine interest rather than diplomatic deflection. "Collaborative solutions?" Tom felt the moment of opportunity opening as he recognized that Blackwood's background might include enough historical and strategic knowledge to appreciate the true significance of what they'd discovered. Sustainable extraction methods, environmental restoration techniques, social organization models that could address current resource conflicts, all preserved in stone tablets that document 7 centuries of successful cooperation. The industrial machinery continued its ominous preparation around them, but Tom sensed that the conversation had reached a critical juncture where corporate destruction might be delayed or redirected if they could demonstrate the practical value of preserving rather than destroying the archive. The choice of legacy. The Arizona sun reached its zenith as the three figures stood amid the industrial machinery that had transformed Tom's ancestral mining claim into a battleground between preservation and extraction. Blackwood studied the documentation that Tom and Sarah had brought from the underground archive, his expression revealing the careful calculation of someone weighing competing interests and strategic implications. Sustainable mining techniques that predate industrial environmental damage, Blackwood read from Sarah's photographs, his voice carrying new respect for the implications of their discovery. Social organization models that successfully integrated resource extraction with environmental preservation. Tom watched the corporate enforcer's face as understanding dawned about the potential value of preserving rather than destroying the archive. Mr. Blackwood, your corporate sponsors are spending millions to address environmental challenges and social conflicts related to mining operations. The solutions are already here, tested across centuries of successful implementation. Sarah added her institutional authority to the moment of decision. Academic documentation, tribal historical validation, and practical mining expertise, all confirming that this archive contains functional solutions to contemporary corporate and environmental challenges. The industrial machinery around them represented millions of dollars in extraction equipment and hundreds of jobs dependent on mining operations that used environmentally destructive methods to extract resources that were becoming increasingly scarce and expensive. But the archive offered alternative approaches that could maintain profitability while eliminating environmental damage and social conflict. Blackwood spoke into his radio with quiet authority, issuing instructions that gradually silenced the drilling operations and brought the industrial destruction to a halt. All units stand down. Corporate priorities are being reassessed based on new information. Tom felt 15 years of grief and obsession transforming into something larger and more purposeful as he recognized that his grandfather's vision was finally being realized. Not through academic discovery or corporate validation, but through practical demonstration that preserved knowledge could address contemporary challenges. The foundation, Tom said, understanding finally crystallizing about his path forward. Corporate sponsorship, academic research, and tribal authority working together to implement the collaborative solutions rather than just preserving them as historical curiosities. Sarah nodded with excitement about possibilities that extended far beyond archaeological discovery. Sustainable mining operations, environmental restoration projects, social organization models that could transform resource extraction throughout the Southwest. Blackwood extended his hand with genuine respect rather than corporate politeness. Mr. McKenzie, Dr. Yazzie, I believe my employers would be very interested in sponsoring research that could provide competitive advantages through sustainable technological innovation. As the three of them stood among the silenced machinery, Tom felt the weight of 7 centuries of preserved knowledge settling into purpose that honored both his family's legacy and the collaborative vision that had created the archive. His grandfather had died believing that some discoveries were worth more than personal fortune. Now Tom understood that the greatest treasures were those that could serve future generations rather than just rewarding individual ambition. The medallion around his neck had grown cool again, its purpose fulfilled not through finding treasure, but through finding wisdom, and the responsibility to use that wisdom for something greater than personal redemption. But this transformation is only the beginning. How will Tom navigate the complex intersection of corporate interests, academic research, and tribal authority as they work to implement centuries-old solutions to modern challenges? What other secrets lie hidden in the archive, and what forces will emerge to either support or sabotage their efforts to bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary needs? The answers await in the deeper exploration of knowledge that was preserved not just to survive, but to serve, and in the understanding that some legacies are too valuable to remain buried in the past when they could illuminate the path to a more sustainable future.